They didn't just survive. They outlived most of the ancient world. And the reason has almost nothing to do with what you'd expect. Most people picture ancient Egypt as this mythological place. Massive temples, gold, elaborate rituals, but almost nobody stops to ask the obvious question. How did millions of people living in one of the most densely populated civilizations in the ancient world not wipe themselves out from disease? No antibiotics, no sterile water, no sewage systems in the modern sense. And yet, Egyptian civilization lasted for 3,000 years. 3,000. That's longer than the entire period from the fall of Rome to right now. Something kept them alive. And when you start looking at what that actually was, the answer changes every time you think you have it. Let's start with something small. The teeth. Archaeologists who study Egyptian mummies almost universally note one thing: severe dental wear. The bread was gritty, the grain was ground on stone, and stone particles ended up in almost every meal. Egyptian teeth were ground down to almost nothing by Middle Age. So you'd expect the same level of damage everywhere else, right? The same carelessness, the same neglect. But here's where it starts getting strange. The same archaeologists who document the dental damage also consistently find something unexpected in the skeletal remains. Evidence of surgery, not primitive attempts, actual surgical procedures, bone that had been cut and then healed, meaning the patient survived the operation, in bodies from 4,000 years ago. Most people completely miss this detail when they think about ancient hygiene. They're focused on what Egyptians didn't have. Very few people ask what they'd figured out that we still don't fully understand. Let's talk about what Egyptians actually did know. They had a documented medical system. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains over 700 formulas and treatments. It's not mythology, it's not ritual, it reads more like a medical reference manual. They cataloged infections, they described inflammation, they recommended honey for open wounds, and that detail is more interesting than it sounds. Honey has documented antimicrobial properties. Modern research has confirmed this. It creates an environment where certain bacteria simply cannot survive. The Egyptians didn't know why it worked, but they knew it worked, and they kept using it. That distinction matters, because it means they were doing something that modern science has since validated without having the framework to explain it. But this is where it gets strange. Honey wasn't the only thing they were using. Garlic was distributed to workers building the pyramids. We know this from accounting records, not legend. Actual supply records show garlic being allocated like a utility. At the time, it was probably understood as food and medicine. Today, we know garlic contains allicin, a compound with real antibacterial activity, castor oil, aloe vera, willow bark, which contains a precursor to aspirin. These weren't random choices. They were documented, repeated, and refined over centuries. And that's not even the weirdest part. They also washed obsessively. Priests bathed multiple times a day. The general population bathed in the Nile, which, yes, also contained crocodiles and parasites. But the practice of regular washing wasn't ceremonial in origin. It had documented health implications. The detail almost nobody talks about is that Egyptian physicians understood the connection between cleanliness and disease outcome, even without understanding germ theory. They couldn't see bacteria, but they noticed patterns. And in a world without microscopes, pattern recognition was medicine. Here's where the picture starts to shift. Because if the Egyptians were this sophisticated, if they had functioning medical knowledge, documented treatments, and observable hygiene practices, why did so many of them still die young? The average lifespan was somewhere in the mid-30s. That number stops you, but here's what most people don't know. That average is dragged down by infant mortality. If an Egyptian survived childhood, if they made it past 5 years old, their expected lifespan looked dramatically different, closer to 50 or 60. The life expectancy number isn't a story about medicine failing. It's a story about how dangerous the first years of life were for every ancient civilization, not just Egypt. So the actual question isn't why Egyptians died young, it's why they survived as well as they did. And when you look at it from that angle, the whole thing starts to feel different. What if the survival wasn't about medicine at all? What if the most important factor was something structural, something built into how Egyptian society was organized? Think about this. The Nile floods every year. That regularity created something rare in the ancient world, a predictable food supply. Predictable enough that Egypt could support a large, stable population without the constant cycles of famine that devastated other civilizations. Nutrition, consistency, lower baseline stress on the immune system. Not medicine, not ritual, just food security. But that raises a harder question. Because if you remove the famine variable, you still have a civilization living in close proximity to millions of people using the same river for drinking water, bathing, and waste. You still have heat, insects, open wounds. At what point does the explanation stop being satisfying? This is exactly what still confuses researchers today. The Egyptian immune system wasn't different from ours. Their bodies didn't have some biological advantage we've since lost. What they had was exposure. Generations of exposure to specific pathogens, which meant over time, a population that had developed partial resistance to the diseases most likely to kill them. Not immunity, resistance. There's documented evidence of parasitic infections throughout the mummy record. Schistosomiasis, malaria, tuberculosis, these weren't rare. They were everywhere. And the population survived them, not because they cured them, but because they adapted to living with them, which raises a question that's genuinely uncomfortable. What if survival in the ancient world wasn't primarily about medicine or hygiene? What if it was about adaptation? And adaptation is something that only works at the population level, not the individual level. Meaning, the individuals who couldn't tolerate the environment died, and the ones who could reproduced. If you're thinking that sounds brutal, you're right. But it also means the population that built those pyramids, maintained those irrigation systems, and ran that civilization for 3,000 years was, in a very specific sense, selected for endurance. Does that change how you think about what they built? There are researchers who argue that Egyptian medical knowledge was more empirical than we give it credit for, closer to early scientific method than to superstition. There are others who argue the opposite, that the medical papyri are full of magical incantations alongside practical remedies, and that separating the two is something we do in hindsight, not something the Egyptians themselves did. Both positions are defensible, and the space between them is where the real question lives. Because the truth might be that both things were happening simultaneously. That practical observation and ritual belief weren't separate categories. That they reinforce each other in ways that produce outcomes that were by accident or design, sometimes effective. That's not a clean answer, but it might be the accurate one. Here's what we actually know. Egyptian civilization lasted longer than any other in the ancient world. Their medical knowledge was specific enough to survive in written form, and specific enough that modern pharmacology has validated portions of it. Their population density requires some form of disease management, and they had one, even if it wasn't the one we'd recognize. And the people who built some of the most enduring structures in human history did it without a single tool we would consider modern. So either we've been drastically underestimating what ancient populations understood about their own survival, or something far more random was happening, and civilization is less fragile than we think, that it can sustain itself even in conditions we consider impossible. Which of those two possibilities makes you more uncomfortable? If questions like this stay with you after the video ends, you probably already know what that says about how you think. Most people move past the surface. You're still here.